For months, we've been talking about the political efforts to end the war in Ukraine, both in public and behind the scenes. But as European leaders prepare to revisit proposals for a ceasefire this week, Volodymyr Zelensky characterised their discussions as a plan merely to begin diplomacy. Rarely has the Ukrainian president spelled out so concisely his belief that Russia is yet to come to the table in good faith. It's a position recent evidence suggests Donald Trump tends to share. And following those surprise US sanctions, the EU had been expected to finally move to mobilise €140 billion worth of frozen Russian assets in the form of a so-called reparations loan. But Belgium, which controls the bulk of the funds, seemingly got cold feet, and a decision has been postponed until December. So, can renewed energy behind the campaign to reach a ceasefire reap any rewards without further economic pressure being applied to Moscow? As always, plenty of you have been in touch, and we'll be answering all of your questions here in the studio with our expert panel.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Laura Gozzi.
I'm Olga Robinson.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
We're going to start with a follow-up to a topic we covered last week about what Europe is doing with frozen Russian assets.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Michael in Cardiff. Why are we so scared to use or let Ukraine have the seized Russian money? Surely it's never going to be given back to Russia, so why not just use it?
Why not just use it? Laura, you're the money woman. Tell us about it.
Against all expectations, Belgium ended up being the sticking point here at this EU summit that they held last week, where EU member states were trying to find a way to basically use these 140 billion euros in Russian frozen assets. So because this money is being held in a Belgium-based financial institution called Euroclear, Belgium is essentially very worried that legally this season would be very tenuous and that Moscow could send, as I've heard it phrased, an army of lawyers to Belgium to basically demand its money back. And so essentially the Belgian Prime Minister last week asked EU countries for guarantees that they would help shoulder the risk. So he asked them to commit to, if the money is not paid back, to chipping in, to commit to also releasing their own Russian frozen assets that they're holding in their financial institutions. The leaders couldn't come to an agreement, and so they basically, as EU countries often do, they kick the can to the next summit in December. Between now and then, they will try and reassure Belgium, essentially, that they will share the burden and the risk. But an additional problem is that Ukraine is projected to run out of cash by March. So clock is ticking, and as of right now, we're not closer to a solution.
I mean, those fears, the Russia lawyering itself up, I mean, they've been there all along, haven't they? But expectations were raised this time that somehow there was a different attitude or a different outcome possible.
Well, that's right. And I think it's just because the sum of money sitting in this financial institution is so great that it could genuinely help Ukraine that has a massive hole in its budget. And so they have been trying to find ways around this. But they are also, as we were saying last week, there is also genuine concern about messing with financial legislation in a way that's never been done before. And countries are just very worried that this might spook other investors or other, holders from depositing their money in their banks.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks for the question, Michael. Let's get on to the next one because we're back to that word again, ceasefire.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Steve in Great Malvern. I wanted to ask why, in the current ceasefire sanctions discussions, people only talk about full ceasefire and where troops should withdraw to and whether that's the current battle line. Surely a more immediate and easy to achieve ceasefire would be to stop the nightly missile attacks on civilian targets and infrastructure. Why has the US and Europe overlooked this possible stepping stone? Even if Russia's allies such as China support their point of view RE territory, surely they can't publicly stand behind bombing civilians. Shouldn't this be called out?
Let's start with where we are with ceasefire talks. Vitaly, where are we?
Nowhere. They've been trying to achieve it for, almost half a year, give or take. And there are different degrees of ceasefire that have been proposed and discussed, ceasefire in the air, on land and at sea. Comprehensive, partial ceasefires. There was a ceasefire proposed for Russia's Victory Day. And, none of it happened, unfortunately. And when we're talking about Russia's nightly attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilians, Steve is absolutely right that it's a very good starting point. But the big question is, how do you make Russia stop? When it comes to countries and politicians supporting or opposing the targeting of civilians, Russia's aware that it's a really bad look to do it. That's why they're denying it. Consistently, they've been saying, no, we never do it. We only target military infrastructure. But this is demonstrably untrue. Anytime it happens, have a look at what, verifiable pictures coming from the ground, and you see civilians killed, including today. Zaporizhia, at least 2 people dead in an attack on a dormitory. So it keeps happening.
Yeah, Olga, that is the bottom line, isn't it? That Russia denies it is doing this, targeting civilians. So to get it to agree to a ceasefire on those terms would be difficult.
And then also, let's not forget that in spring there was a talk about energy ceasefire for 30 days that Putin proposed in his telephone conversation with Donald Trump. But then Ukraine, literally a month later, was saying, well, they've violated it 30 times during that period of time. And at the same time, some analysts were saying at the time that Russia is using this partial ceasefire effectively as a decoy to delay negotiations, but also to stop Ukrainian strikes on its energy infrastructure, which is hurting Russian economy. And if we've been tracking the oil refineries attacks inside Russia, and you can clearly see a massive dip in the number of strikes at around the time that talk was happening. So it's spring, and Russia got the respite in the end because there were no attacks in March, April, and May recorded.
As to why this is happening, I think it's very simple. The world community has not given Putin enough reason to stop. It's as simple as that.
And I suppose from the Ukrainian point of view, is it in their interest to stop their attacks on civilian infrastructure at the moment? Because that's having, as you say, an impact.
Yeah, because I think partial ceasefire, like from a Ukrainian perspective, what they really need is a full ceasefire. And that would make a difference. Whereas we know from previous attempts with ceasefire, what is happening is that Russia uses the respite to, gather troops and then prepare for future attacks. So it has limited benefit to like the partial ceasefire when it comes to energy infrastructure strikes. It has only partial benefit for Ukraine because it means they have to stop the one thing that they have been successfully doing in terms of trying to put pressure on the Russian war machine.
It's also notable that initially, you will remember, of course, it was Ukraine that was opposed to a ceasefire. This is the point that Vladimir Zelensky was making. If there's a ceasefire, Russia will use it to regroup, amass its troops, and then strike again. Following that, when Donald Trump came to power, he, it seems, put pressure on Ukraine and said, no, let's ceasefire and talk. That was a key proposal made by Washington, ceasefire and talk. Under that pressure, Vladimir Zelensky relented and said, okay, let's ceasefire, we're ready for that. Now it's Russia essentially saying what Zelensky was saying. Oh, if we cease fire, Ukraine will regroup and reamass its troops and then attack us again.
Well, I think to your point, in terms of how stances have changed around ceasefire or peace. I mean, I remember just before the Alaska summit, Trump had initially gone in looking for a ceasefire, and then as it often happens when he speaks to Putin, he comes out of that conversation with his mind changed, and suddenly he was pushing for full-blown peace. That is obviously so much harder to achieve, because if the idea, as Ukraine has said over and over again, if the idea is that it wants a just and lasting peace, there is just so much that the two sides will not agree on. Again, we've addressed these before. Fundamental differences on the essence of Ukraine as a country, and if that is what stands in the way of peace, to be honest, there's a really long way to go before we get anywhere near even the beginning of a resolution.
Steve, many thanks. A lot of food for thought about possible ceasefires there. And I'm going to turn to another question. I think this one's up your street, Olga. It's from Mark Pax, who asks on Discord, I saw a news report about a Russian dam being busted by Ukraine, but I didn't get any more details. How was it done, and what was the effect, the Ukrainian dam busting?
Yeah, it's actually doesn't happen that often as an occurrence. So this dam is located on one of the border regions, Belgorod region, on the border with Ukraine. And it was struck by a Ukrainian drone over the weekend on Saturday. And it was confirmed by the head of the unmanned forces, so the drone units in Ukraine. So they had confirmed that it had been struck. We spent pretty much Monday and Tuesday looking at the impact of that strike, because what we started seeing is quite dramatic pictures of the dam being breached, but it wasn't. We're not looking at the Kakhovka level destruction, because it was a drone, and drones usually have limited impact when it comes to.
And the dam still stands.
The dam still stands. One of our colleagues who specialized in satellite imagery analysis, she was looking at special kind of radar imagery, because it's quite cloudy, so you can't see with normal pictures the impact of the flooding, and you can see that there's been a bit of flooding, but it's not very, very dramatic. And what we started seeing in the past few days is images and videos of what sounds like Russian servicemen, usually very close up, so you can't really verify it where it really is, walking through really flooded positions and saying, well, I'm all wet, we're trying to move, and there's nowhere to hide, and it's not great, but these Ukrainians. And it's repeat kind of scene that you can see on social media. Really difficult to locate, so it's difficult to say. There have been claims that some of the units that cross the Seversky Donetsk River, that have been cut off, but it's really difficult to prove it forensically, because we can't verify some of the footage showing them in those flooded areas.
Which kind of calls a few questions in my mind about the Kakhovka and the long-term impact of that. Let's, though, turn to another question that involves a rather larger stretch of water. It comes from Mike in Surrey, who asks, there are only two exits from the Baltic Sea. These are narrow, and their waters are owned by Denmark and Sweden. Could the Danes and the Swedes legally stop every tanker of interest to inspect their documents regarding cargo, registration, safety certification and insurance, and detain any tanker and its officers where appropriate, with a NATO warship in the vicinity? I beg your pardon.
So it's an important route. There are two key Russian ports involved in using that route to export Russian oil, much of it in violation of Western imposed sanctions. Ust-Luga and Primorsk, those are two ports. Now, as far as I understand, more than a tenth of Russian seaborne crude exports are using that route. Now, as for Mike's question, can they do it legally? No, they can't, for a number of reasons, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which says even if those straits are, technically speaking, in your territory, you are supposed to provide any vessel with the right of passage, unless they're committing something atrocious, such as polluting the environment. So, no, they can't for legal reasons. And given that certain countries and certain players are shall I say, playing hard and fast with international laws, there are also very practical reasons why this will not necessarily be a good idea. You will remember when Estonia, back in May, tried to stop a tanker that they suspected was part of the Russian shadow fleet. They tried to board it and inspect its documents because they said it wasn't flagged in any country. It was literally stateless or flagless. The tanker in question refused and kept moving, and Russia dispatched a fighter jet which entered Estonian airspace. So Russia has demonstrated that it's prepared to defend its shadow fleet, and Estonia had to, well, essentially back down and allow the tanker to keep going. So if Denmark or indeed Sweden decide to stop those tankers, are they prepared to engage in a military confrontation with Russia? It keeps coming to that question. Are you prepared to fight Russia?
Let's stick with the Baltics, the region at least, and we've got this question which has come to us from Italy.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Mosin from Italy. With the Baltic states beginning to ban Russian citizens from voting in local elections and forcing ethnic Russians to either learn Latvian, Lithuanian, or Estonian, will Vladimir Putin use this as an excuse to invade them?
Right. Well, there's an assertion there. I suppose we should deal with that first of all. Who wants to take on this question of what is actually happening to Russian citizens in the Baltic countries?
Well, first thing I want to say, unless I missed something really, really important and big, I'm not sure they are. The Baltic states are beginning to implement a new policy of any sort. For years, they have consistently required Russian speakers to pass various tests, such as language tests, security checks, in Latvia's case, for example, to become their citizens. And as we all know, in the vast majority of cases worldwide, to vote in elections, you have to be a citizen of that country. And when it comes to language, what we're seeing in the Baltic states and elsewhere across the former Soviet Union are individual governments making efforts to protect their language and restore its use after decades of suppression by the central government in Moscow. So this is what happened in the Baltic states, and this is what happened in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, yes, this is what Vladimir Putin used as one of the numerous excuses to invade. Will he possibly use that excuse in the Baltics? Well, it's not that he will struggle to find an excuse to invade. The question is, will Putin feel confident enough that that invasion will succeed? At this moment in time, my opinion is that he is bogged down in Ukraine, and that will prevent him from launching an open invasion of either Baltic states or Poland, for example.
Of NATO countries.
Of NATO countries. When we're talking about hybrid warfare, covert operations, testing NATO's resolve, that's a different matter. We've seen instances of that already happening. Arson attacks, drones and aircraft violating NATO airspace, that is already happening.
To Vitaly's point about the cost that what Russia would have to go for if they do try and invade Baltic states, I mean, let's not forget that they've been trying to take parts of the Donetsk region, the Donbass, for years now, and the progress is so slow. Yeah, we are seeing kind of some movement around Pokrovsk, the logistical hub at the moment, but the cost in terms of men and equipment is enormous. And, they're still selling it to the Russian population as a special military operation, not full-scale war.
I suppose one thing we haven't really addressed, Vitaly, is how important all those sea routes are to Russia when it comes to supplies. I mean, obviously we're looking now in the context of new sanctions on oil companies, but in terms of supplies, how important is all this to Russia?
They're important, but to an extent. other routes are available, pipelines to China, the Black Sea to export oil and gas southwards. So if something were to happen to Russia's sea routes across the Baltic, for example, that would be a bit of a blow, an inconvenience to Russia, but it will not be lethal. The bigger question is whether China and India, which are buying almost all of Russia's crude, 85%, are they going to be affected by Donald Trump's recent sanctions against Russian oil? The latest I've seen suggests that they are, especially India, are looking for ways to circumvent those sanctions. So there are reasonable grounds to be skeptical about whether those sanctions are going to work. So as Olga says, there are kind of physical issues at play, sea routes, land routes, and there are also legal and geopolitical and economic reasons that are hugely, hugely important for Vladimir Putin to keep on fighting Ukraine.
Well, we're talking, of course, just after Donald Trump has had his first meeting with President Xi in this second term, and they were talking about bilateral issues, but certainly, I spoke to a Republican congressman on air who visited China recently, and he said, look, we are going to be talking about Ukraine, we're going to be talking about China and its role that it could play in ending the war in Ukraine. So interesting to see if what possibly has been going on behind the scenes there.
If President Xi were to genuinely and seriously want this war to be over, it would be over in an instant. Vladimir Putin would not be able to pursue it any longer without China's support.
And Laura, of course, we're talking about Donald Trump. He has been responding with talk about some kind of nuclear testing resuming. We don't know exactly what, to Russia testing various new missiles, torpedoes. Just bring us up to date, because I know you've been looking at this.
Yes, I mean, in the last week alone, Putin has, or rather Russia has announced that it had tested the Burevestnik missile. This was last weekend. And then yesterday, Putin unveiled a new nuclear-powered torpedo submarine. And I think if it sounds menacing, that's the whole point. And I think what's interesting, what's been happening in the last, probably since the Budapest summit between Trump and Putin sort of disappeared as an option. What Putin has been doing is he's militarized his messaging, I find. He's appeared in uniform a couple of times, which he typically doesn't do. He's been talking to his chief of staff, Gerasimov. He's been testing these weapons and unveiling more. So I think there's a concerted effort here to kind of show the West that Russia is not backing down, no matter, the rumors about how badly its economy is doing, how many difficulties it's having on the battlefield. And probably, in a sense, it's also trying to speak Trump's language, because Putin knows that Trump will generally listen to big words about big weapons. And given the fact that he responded on social media, but nonetheless responded on the sidelines of his summit with Xi last night or in the early hours of this morning, I mean, I think that goes to show that he does listen, he does pay attention.
They've tried the flattery, so they're trying the escalation, the military escalation. I
mean, we're forever talking about the carrot and the stick, and I think the stick here is the big weapon.
Indeed. Laura, thanks very much, and thank you for watching. And do remember, if you want more from us, you can just search for Ukrainecast wherever you get your BBC podcasts, and we will be back next week. Until then, bye-bye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.